There's something about a child's voice that cuts through everything else. It pierces through the noise of a busy household, through the hum of everyday life, through years of memory. And when that voice goes silent when it's taken too soon, it leaves behind an echo that never quite fades. On February 28, 2013, a 4-year-old boy named Eric Dean died in a hospital in Alexandria, Minnesota. His small body, weighing just 33 pounds, bore the evidence of a war he never had a chance to win. Bruises covered nearly every inch of his skin. Bite marks dotted his face, his ears, his tiny arms. His intestine had been perforated, allowing bacteria to flood his abdomen, poisoning him from the inside out. The medical examiner would later count the injuries, documenting them one by one, but even numbers couldn't capture the full scope of what had been done to this child. Eric's death wasn't sudden. It wasn't an accident. It was the final page of a story that had been written over years, a story that dozens of people had tried to read but never quite finished. Because Eric Dean didn't die in silence. He died screaming in a system that heard him but didn't listen. This is the story of a boy who should still be alive today. A boy who told anyone who would pay attention that he was being hurt. A boy whose small body carried evidence that couldn't be ignored, yet somehow was. This is the story of Eric Dean and the 15 times the system had a chance to save him. The 911 call came in at 9:37 in the morning, February 28, 2013. The address was a modest home in Glenwood, Minnesota, a small town in Pope County where everybody knows everybody, where people leave their doors unlocked and trust their neighbors. The kind of place where something like this wasn't supposed to happen. The caller was a woman, Amanda Peltier, 24 years old. Her voice on that call was measured, almost eerily calm for someone reporting that a child wasn't breathing. She told the dispatcher that her 4-year-old stepson, Eric Dean, had been sick for a couple of days, throwing up, not eating, and now he wasn't waking up. The dispatcher asked standard questions. Was the child breathing? Peltier said no. Was he conscious? No. How long had he been like this? She wasn't sure. Maybe she found him like this an hour ago, maybe longer. The timeline was fuzzy, shifting even in those first critical moments. Emergency responders arrived within minutes. They found Eric lying motionless in his bed, his small body cold to the touch. His skin had already begun to take on that waxy, grayish pallor that paramedics recognize instantly. They knew, even before they started chest compressions, that this child had been gone for some time. But they tried anyway because that's what you do. You try. Eric was rushed to Glacial Ridge Hospital in Glenwood, where doctors and nurses worked frantically to bring him back. They intubated him, pumped his chest, pushed drugs into his tiny veins. For 23 minutes they fought. But Eric Dean had been fighting a much longer battle, one that had already been lost. At 10:26 that morning, 4-year-old Eric Parker Dean was pronounced dead. Dr. Michael Magee, the emergency room physician, stood over the small body and felt something shift in his gut. This wasn't right. He'd seen sick children before, children who'd succumbed to sudden illness or tragic accidents. This was different. As he examined Eric, he saw what no sick child should have. Fresh bruises on the arms, old bruises on the legs, marks on the face. And when they undressed him completely, the full horror revealed itself. Eric's body was a roadmap of abuse. Bruises in various stages of healing, from fresh purple to fatting yellow-green, covered his torso, his back, his buttocks, his thighs. There were patterned injuries, the kind that come from objects rather than falls. There were bite marks, human bite marks on his face, his ears, his shoulders. Some were old, partially healed. Some were fresh. Dr. Magee made the call that should have been made a dozen times before. He contacted law enforcement and child protection. This was not an illness. This was not an accident. This was a homicide. The subsequent autopsy, performed by Dr. Michael Magee and Dr. Janice Amatuzio, would reveal even more. Eric had died from septic shock caused by a perforated small intestine. Blunt force trauma had torn through the delicate tissue, allowing intestinal contents to spill into his abdominal cavity. The resulting infection had overwhelmed his small body. He had likely been in excruciating pain for at least 24 to 48 hours before his death. The perforated intestine was just one injury among many. The autopsy documented over 100 distinct marks on Eric's body, 100 separate instances of harm inflicted on a child who weighed 33 pounds and stood 3 feet tall. There were contusions on his head, his face, his neck, his chest, his abdomen, his back, his arms, his legs. There were abrasions and lacerations. There were those bite marks, confirmed by a forensic odontologist to be from an adult human. There were loop-shaped marks consistent with being struck with a cord or belt. There were fingertip bruises, the kind that come from grabbing a child too hard, too often. The medical examiner's conclusion was unequivocal: homicide by child abuse. The manner of death: homicide. The cause of death: blunt force trauma to the abdomen with perforation of the small intestine, leading to peritonitis and septic shock. Eric Dean had been tortured to death in his own home, and the question that would haunt everyone who learned his story was simple, devastating, and impossible to answer. How did this happen? Eric Parker Dean entered the world on December 27, 2008, in the dead of a Minnesota winter. His mother was Summer Kemp, a young woman who was already struggling with the responsibilities of parenthood. His father was David Dean, who at the time of Eric's birth was not in a relationship with Summer. From the very beginning, Eric's life would be split between two homes, two parents, two different worlds. In those early months and years, Eric lived primarily with his mother, and from the very beginning there were warning signs that something wasn't right. The first report of suspected child abuse came when Eric was just 2 months old, February 2009. A concerned party, whose name was redacted in court documents, contacted Child Protection Services in Pope County with concerns about Eric's care. The report was screened in, meaning it met the threshold for investigation. A social worker was assigned, but after initial contact with the family, the case was closed. No maltreatment found, no services needed. It wouldn't be the last time that phrase appeared in Eric's file. As a toddler, Eric was described by those who knew him as sweet, energetic, curious. He had his father's eyes and a smile that could light up a room, but he was also a child who seemed always on edge, hypervigilant in a way that small children shouldn't be. He startled easily. He was afraid of sudden movements. He watched adults carefully, as if trying to anticipate what might happen next. Living with his mother, Eric experienced instability. Summer Kemp struggled with her own demons, including substance abuse issues. There were periods when she was doing better, periods when Eric seemed cared for, but there were other periods, darker periods, when neglect crept in. Reports came in sporadically. A neighbor concerned about loud fights in the apartment. A family member who noticed Eric seemed thin, seemed scared. Each time the county investigated. Each time they found either no maltreatment or maltreatment that didn't rise to the level requiring intervention. Understanding the child protection system is crucial to understanding how Eric fell through its cracks. In Minnesota, as in most states, not every report of suspected child abuse or neglect results in a full investigation. Reports are screened, meaning a social worker reviews the information and determines whether it meets specific criteria. Does the report allege a specific type of maltreatment? Is the alleged perpetrator someone in a caretaking role? Is there enough information to locate the family? If the report doesn't meet these criteria, it's screened out and no investigation occurs. Even when a report is screened in, the investigation has limits. Social workers typically interview the family, observe the child, and assess the home environment. But they're working with limited information, limited time, and limited resources. They're trying to distinguish between accidents and abuse, between poor parenting and criminal behavior. It's an impossible job, made more impossible by the fact that abusers lie, children are afraid to speak, and physical evidence can be explained away. In Eric's case, Multiple reports from his time with his mother were screened out or investigated and closed. The system saw a struggling young mother, a child who seemed okay in the moments when social workers observed him, and a situation that, while not ideal, didn't quite meet the threshold for removal. It's easy, in hindsight, to condemn those decisions. But at the time, with the information they had, the social workers made the calls they thought were right. What no one could have predicted was that removing Eric from one dangerous situation would place him in another, far worse. In November 2010, when Eric was almost 2 years old, his life changed dramatically. David Dean, Eric's father, had been fighting for more time with his son. He'd been paying child support, exercising his visitation rights, trying to be present in Eric's life despite not being with Sommer. And as he watched from the sidelines, he grew increasingly concerned about what he saw. Eric seemed withdrawn after visits with his mother. He'd come to David's house with mysterious bruises, with stories that didn't quite add up. David began documenting everything, taking photos, keeping notes. He consulted with attorneys, and finally he filed for custody. The custody battle was not easy. Family courts are complicated, messy places where two sides present competing versions of reality and a judge has to decide who's telling the truth. But David had documentation. He had concerns. He had a stable home and a steady job working in the construction industry, and crucially, he had Amanda. Amanda Peltier was 22 years old when she met David Dean. She was young, blonde, energetic. She worked at a local restaurant and had grown up in the area. By all accounts, she was friendly, outgoing, the kind of person who seemed reliable. When David told her about his son, about his fight for custody, Amanda was supportive. She told David she wanted to help. She said she'd always loved children, that she couldn't wait to be a mother figure to Eric. In November 2010, David Dean was granted primary custody of Eric. The little boy, not quite 2 years old, moved into his father's home in Glenwood, Minnesota, and David, relieved and hopeful, believed he'd done it. He'd saved his son. He'd brought Eric to safety. The home David provided seemed stable on paper. It was a modest single-family house in a quiet neighborhood. David worked regular hours and made enough money to support his family. Amanda, who soon moved in with David, seemed devoted to the household. Neighbors would later describe them as a normal family, the kind you'd wave to as you got your mail or shoveled your driveway. But inside that house, behind closed doors, something was already beginning to go very wrong. Eric's transition to his father's home was not easy. Any toddler would struggle with such a dramatic change, moving from his mother to his father, from one home to another. Eric clung to his father in those early days. He cried when David left for work. He had nightmares. He was learning to trust his new environment, to believe that this place was safe. And for a while, maybe it was. David Dean, by all accounts, loved his son. He wanted the best for Eric. He'd fought hard to bring him into his home, and he was determined to give Eric the childhood he deserved. But David worked long hours. Construction jobs don't allow for flexible schedules or work-from-home days, which meant that increasingly, Eric was left in Amanda's care. Just Eric and Amanda, alone in that house for hours at a time. At first, Amanda seemed to embrace the role. She'd post photos on social media of her and Eric, painting a picture of domestic bliss. "My little man," she'd caption them. She'd talk to friends about how much she loved being a mom, how natural it felt. She'd volunteer to take Eric to appointments, to watch him while David worked overtime, to be the primary caretaker. But somewhere in those early months, something shifted. Maybe Amanda realized that caring for a toddler was harder than she'd imagined. Maybe she resented the responsibility, the loss of freedom, the way Eric demanded attention that she'd rather have given to David. Maybe there was something darker in her, something that had always been there, just waiting for the opportunity to emerge. Whatever the reason, by the spring of 2011, just a few months after Eric moved in, the abuse had begun. Colleen Mislicki ran a home daycare in Glenwood. She'd been caring for children for years, and she prided herself on creating a safe, nurturing environment. When David Dean contacted her in early 2011 about care for his son Eric, she was happy to help. Eric was 2.5 years old, a sweet little boy who was a bit shy at first but quickly warmed up. In those first weeks, Colleen watched Eric carefully, as she did with all new children. She noticed he was clingy, that he wanted constant reassurance. But that wasn't unusual for a child adjusting to a new caregiver. She noticed he had a good appetite, that he loved playing with the other kids, that he laughed easily once he felt comfortable. But she also noticed things that troubled her. There were bruises, not the kind you'd expect on an active toddler, the kind on knees and shins from running and falling. These were bruises on Eric's arms, on his back, on his upper thighs. When Colleen asked Eric what happened, he'd give vague answers. He fell. He bumped into something. He didn't remember. Then, in April 2011, Colleen saw something that made her blood run cold. She was helping Eric wash his hands before lunch when she noticed his shirt had ridden up. On his lower back, there was a mark, a bite mark, a clear, unmistakable impression of human teeth pressed into a child's skin. Colleen's hands shook as she gently asked Eric, "Sweetie, what happened to your back?" Eric's response was immediate, automatic, as if he'd rehearsed it. "I don't know." "Did someone bite you?" Eric looked down, his little shoulders hunching. He didn't answer. Colleen knew she had to report this. Minnesota law is clear. Mandated reporters, which include daycare providers, teachers, medical professionals, and others who work with children, are required to report suspected child abuse. It's not their job to investigate or to be certain. If they have reason to suspect maltreatment, they must report. That day, Colleen called Pope County Child Protection. She described the bite mark, the bruises, her concerns. She gave Eric's name, his address, his parents' names. She waited for someone to do something. The report was screened in. A social worker was assigned. And within days, someone from the county contacted David Dean and Amanda Peltier. The interview, conducted at the family's home, went exactly as these interviews often go. The social worker asked about the bite mark. Amanda had an explanation ready. Eric had bitten himself. He did it sometimes when he was frustrated. She'd seen him do it. David nodded along, confirming the story. The social worker asked to see Eric. The little boy was brought out and he was quiet, watchful. The social worker asked him gentle questions. "Did someone hurt you?" Eric shook his head. "Did someone bite you?" Eric looked at Amanda, then back at the social worker. "I did it," he said softly. The social worker observed the home. It was clean, orderly. There was food in the cupboards, toys in the living room. David and Amanda seemed cooperative, concerned, willing to answer questions. They seemed like attentive parents. The investigation was closed. No maltreatment found. The bite mark, the social worker concluded, was self-inflicted. But Colleen Mislicki wasn't convinced, because she kept seeing things. More bruises. Another bite mark, this time on Eric's arm. And once, when she asked Eric about it, he looked at her with his big eyes and said something that stopped her heart. "Mommy did it." Eric called Amanda Mommy. He'd been told to call her that. And now he was telling his daycare provider that Mommy had bitten him. Colleen reported again and again. Each time she documented what she saw. Each time she called the county. Each time she hoped someone would take action. But each time the pattern repeated. The report was screened in. The family was contacted. Amanda had explanations. Eric, in the presence of his parents, recanted. The case was closed. By the summer of 2011, Colleen had made 4 separate reports. 4 times she'd seen evidence of abuse. 4 times she'd called for help. 4 times the system had decided that nothing was wrong. And the abuse was only getting worse. July 11, 2011. David Dean carried his son Eric into the emergency room at Glacial Ridge Hospital in Glenwood. Eric was crying cradling his left arm against his chest. Amanda trailed behind them, her face arranged in an expression of concern. The triage nurse took them back quickly. A child in pain always gets priority. She asked what happened, and David explained. Eric had fallen down the stairs at home. It was an accident. They thought maybe he'd broken his arm. X-rays confirmed it. Eric, age 2.5, had a spiral fracture of his left humerus. That's the long bone in the upper arm, running from shoulder to elbow. It was broken cleanly, the fracture spiraling around the bone in a distinctive pattern. Dr. Mark Hudson, the emergency physician on duty, studied the X-rays with a growing sense of unease. Spiral fractures in young children are red flags. They don't typically result from simple falls. A spiral fracture occurs when a bone is twisted with force, when a limb is wrenched or pulled violently. In pediatric emergency medicine, these fractures are often associated with abuse. Dr. Hudson returned to the exam room and began asking questions. He directed them at David, at Amanda, at both of them. "Tell me exactly what happened." Amanda took the lead in answering. Eric had been playing upstairs, she said. She'd heard a crash and a scream. When she ran to the stairs, Eric was at the bottom, crying. He must have tripped and fallen down. Dr. Hudson nodded, his face neutral, but his mind was racing. He'd been a physician for 15 years. He'd seen countless injuries, and this didn't add up. A fall downstairs typically causes bruising, maybe a simple fracture if a child lands on an outstretched arm. But a spiral fracture, that suggested a twisting motion, a violent pulling or yanking of the arm. He examined Eric more thoroughly, looking for other signs of injury, and he found them. Small bruises on Eric's torso, a fatting mark on his cheek, another bruise on his thigh. "Has Eric had other injuries recently?" Dr. Hudson asked. "He's just clumsy," Amanda said quickly. "He's always bumping into things." Dr. Hudson made his decision. This case needed to be reported. He filed a report with Pope County Child Protection, detailing the spiral fracture, the explanation that didn't match the injury, the other bruises he'd observed. He recommended a full child protection investigation. The county responded within 24 hours. A social worker came to the hospital before Eric was discharged. She interviewed David and Amanda separately, then together. She examined Eric, taking photos of his injuries. She asked about the family's history, about other reports. And there it was in black and white. This family was already known to the system. There had been multiple reports over the past few months from Eric's daycare provider. Reports of bite marks, bruises, concerning statements from Eric. Each had been investigated. Each had been closed as unsubstantiated. The social worker returned to the family. She was direct, more pointed in her questions. "We've received several reports about Eric. There's a pattern here. I need you to be honest with me. Is something going on in your home?" David seemed genuinely confused, even defensive. "He worked all day," he said. "He came home tired, but he loved his son. He'd fought for custody of Eric to protect him. Why would he hurt him?" Amanda remained calm, almost eerily so. She had explanations for everything. The bite marks were self-inflicted. She'd seen Eric bite his own arm when he was having a tantrum. The bruises were from normal toddler activities. The broken arm was from a fall. She was home with Eric all day, and she could account for every injury. The social worker asked to speak with Eric alone. In a quiet room, she knelt down to the little boy's level. "Eric, sweetie, I need to ask you some questions. Is that okay?" Eric nodded, his casted arm held carefully against his body. "How did you hurt your arm?" "I fell." "Where did you fall?" "Down the stairs." "Did anyone push you?" Eric hesitated. For just a moment something flickered in his eyes, fear maybe, or confusion, but then he shook his head. "No, I fell." The social worker probed gently, asking about the bruises, about whether anyone had hurt him. But Eric's answers remained consistent. He fell. He bumped into things. No one hurt him. It's a cruel irony of child abuse cases. The victims often protect their abusers. Children lie to defend the people who hurt them. They do it out of fear, out of confusion, out of a desperate need to keep their family together. Eric was 2.5 years old. He didn't understand that the social worker was trying to help him. He only understood that answering questions might make mommy angry, and when mommy got angry, bad things happened. The investigation continued for several weeks. The social worker visited the home unannounced, checking on Eric. She spoke with Colleen Mislicki at the daycare, who expressed ongoing concerns. She reviewed medical records looking for patterns. But ultimately, she couldn't prove abuse. The fracture could have been accidental. The bruises could have been from normal childhood activities. Eric denied being hurt. His parents seemed cooperative. There was suspicion, yes, but suspicion isn't enough to remove a child from his home. The case was closed. Eric remained with his father and Amanda, and the social worker in her notes wrote a sentence that would later haunt everyone who read it. This is a high-risk family. Continued monitoring recommended. But continued monitoring didn't happen. With the case closed, the county had no mandate to follow up, and within weeks, Eric stopped going to Colleen Mislicki's daycare. Amanda told David she wanted to care for Eric herself at home. She said it would be better for him, more stable than daycare. David, trusting her, agreed. Which meant that Eric, at age 2.5, was now alone with Amanda Peltier all day, every day. No daycare provider to notice new injuries. No mandated reporter to make calls. No one to see what was happening behind closed doors. The broken arm healed, the cast came off, and the abuse continued hidden from view. Between the fall of 2011 and early 2013, 15 separate reports of suspected child abuse were made to Pope County regarding Eric Dean. 15 times, someone saw something that concerned them enough to pick up the phone and call for help. 15 times, the system was given an opportunity to intervene. Let that sink in. 15 reports, not 1 or 2 that could be dismissed as misunderstandings, not 3 or 4 that might represent a misguided attempt to harass a family. 15 separate concerns from multiple different sources spanning more than a year. After Eric stopped attending Colleen Mislicki's daycare, Amanda enrolled him in a different program. She had to. David expected Eric to be in some kind of care while he worked. But this time, she chose a larger center, one where Eric would be in a classroom with multiple children and rotating staff. Perhaps she thought he'd be less noticeable there, his injuries easier to hide in the chaos of a busy preschool. She was wrong. The teachers at Happy Times Preschool noticed Eric immediately, not because he was disruptive or difficult, but because he was so quiet, so withdrawn. He didn't play with the other children the way you'd expect a 3-year-old to play. He watched them, observed them, but rarely joined in. When teachers tried to engage him, he'd comply dutifully, but there was no joy in it. No spontaneity. He seemed, one teacher later testified, like a little old man trapped in a child's body. And then there were the injuries. October 2011, a teacher noticed a bite mark on Eric's ear. When she asked him about it, Eric said he didn't remember how it happened. The teacher reported it to the preschool director, who called Pope County. Report number 6. November 2011, another bite mark, this time on Eric's cheek, fresh enough that you could still see the individual tooth marks. Report number 7. December 2011, Eric came to school with bruises on both arms up near his shoulders, fingerprint-shaped bruises, the kind that come from being grabbed hard. Report number 8. January 2012, a bruise on Eric's forehead. Report number 9. Each time the pattern was the same. The report was screened in. A social worker contacted the family. Amanda had explanations. Eric fell. Eric bumped into a door. Eric bit himself. Eric played too rough with the other children at school. And each time when the social worker asked Eric, the little boy confirmed the story. He fell. He bumped into things. He hurt himself, because that's what he'd been taught to say. But the teachers at Happy Times Preschool weren't convinced. They began documenting everything meticulously. They took photos of injuries when they could. They wrote detailed incident reports, noting the date, time, and exact nature of each injury they observed. They compared notes, recognizing that Eric's injuries were far more frequent and severe than those of other children. In February 2012, the preschool director made a decision. She called Pope County not to report a specific injury, but to express a broader concern. She laid out the pattern: multiple bite marks over several months, frequent bruising, a child who seemed fearful and withdrawn. She said in no uncertain terms that she believed Eric Dean was being abused in his home. This report, report number 10, prompted a more thorough investigation. The county sent their most experienced social worker, someone who'd been doing child protection work for over a decade. She reviewed all the previous reports, looking for patterns and connections. She interviewed the preschool staff extensively. She observed Eric at school, watching how he interacted with teachers and peers. Then she made an unannounced home visit. She arrived at David and Amanda's house on a weekday afternoon, when David was at work and Amanda was home alone with Eric. The goal of an unannounced visit is to see the family as they really are, not as they present themselves when they know someone is coming. Amanda answered the door with a smile. She was gracious, welcoming, seemingly unconcerned by the surprise visit. She invited the social worker in, offered her coffee, made small talk. The house was clean, tidy. There were toys scattered in the living room, evidence of a child at play. Eric was sitting on the couch watching television. He looked up when the social worker entered, his eyes wary but not overtly fearful. He was dressed in clean clothes. He didn't appear malnourished or neglected. The social worker asked to speak with Eric alone. Amanda agreed readily, stepping out of the room. This, in itself, was seen as a good sign. Abusive parents often refuse to leave their children alone with investigators, knowing that the truth might emerge. But Eric, alone with the social worker, maintained his story. He fell a lot, he was clumsy. Mommy took good care of him, he loved Mommy. The social worker asked about specific injuries. Eric, I heard you had a bite mark on your ear. Do you remember that? Eric nodded. How did that happen? I don't remember. Did someone bite you? I bit myself. Can you show me how you bit your own ear? Eric tried, bringing his mouth toward his shoulder, attempting to contort himself in a way that might reach his ear. It was physically impossible, and the social worker could see that. But Eric was trying so hard to demonstrate what he'd been told to say. The visit lasted over an hour. The social worker examined Eric, finding healing bruises on his back and legs. She asked Amanda about each one. Amanda had answers for all of them. Eric fell off his bike. Eric tripped over a toy. Eric bumped into the coffee table. Before leaving, the social worker told Amanda plainly, "We've received multiple reports about Eric. I want you to understand that we take these concerns seriously. If we continue to see injuries that can't be adequately explained, we will have to take further action." Amanda nodded solemnly. "I understand. I love Eric like he's my own. I would never hurt him." The social worker left, driving back to her office with a knot in her stomach. She believed Amanda was lying. She believed Eric was being abused, but she couldn't prove it. Eric denied it. The injuries could be explained away. There was no smoking gun, no irrefutable evidence. In her report, she wrote that the family was high risk and recommended ongoing monitoring. But without proof of maltreatment, the case couldn't remain open indefinitely. After 30 days with no new injuries reported, the case was closed. March 2012, report number 11, Eric had a bruise on his neck. April 2012, report number 12, bite marks on his arm. May 2012, report number 13, a black eye. June 2012. Report number 14. Bruises on his buttocks and thighs noticed when Eric was being changed after a bathroom accident. By now, the staff at Happy Times Preschool were making reports almost monthly. They felt helpless, frustrated, increasingly desperate. They could see what was happening to this child. They were documenting it, reporting it, begging someone to intervene. But nothing changed. Eric kept coming to school with new injuries, and he kept going home to the place where those injuries were inflicted. The social workers at Pope County were frustrated too. They knew something was wrong. They suspected strongly that Eric was being abused, but suspicion isn't enough. In the American child protection system, you need evidence. You need proof that rises to a legal standard. You need to be able to convince a judge that a child is in immediate danger, that removal from the home is necessary. And Amanda Peltier was good at avoiding that threshold. She never broke a bone that couldn't be explained by a fall. She never left marks that couldn't be attributed to rough play. She never injured Eric severely enough to require hospitalization, at least not until the very end. She stayed just below the line that would trigger mandatory removal. It was, in a horrible way, calculated, strategic. She knew how far she could go. In October 2012, Happy Times Preschool made report number 15. But this time, they did something else too. They told Amanda that Eric could no longer attend their program. They didn't say it was because they knew she was abusing him. They couldn't make that accusation without legal repercussions. Instead, they cited vague concerns about behavior issues and Eric's needs exceeding what they could provide. It was the hardest decision they'd ever made, kicking out a child they knew needed protection. But they were trapped. They couldn't force the county to act. They couldn't keep Eric safe while he was in their care, knowing he'd go home each day to more abuse. And the emotional toll on their staff, watching a child being hurt and being powerless to stop it, was becoming unbearable. So Eric was kicked out of preschool, and once again he was home full-time with Amanda. No teachers to notice new injuries, no mandated reporters making calls, just Eric, alone with the woman who was torturing him. For the next 4 months, between October 2012 and February 2013, there were no new reports to Pope County. Not because the abuse stopped, but because no one was seeing Eric anymore. He was isolated, hidden away, trapped in that house with Amanda while David worked long hours and remained oblivious to what was happening to his son. Those 4 months, that gap in reports, would later be identified as the critical failure. If Eric had remained in preschool, if there had been eyes on him, someone might have noticed the escalation. Someone might have seen that the abuse was getting worse, more violent, more dangerous. Someone might have called one more time, and maybe that 16th report would have been the one that finally saved him. But there was no 16th report, not until it was too late. It's hard to know exactly what those final months were like for Eric Dean. We can only piece together fragments from the evidence found after his death, from Amanda's eventual statements, from the autopsy that documented the cumulative damage. What we know is that by late 2012, Amanda Peltier's abuse of Eric had escalated beyond bruises and bites. She was hitting him regularly, slapping him across the face hard enough to leave marks. She was throwing things at him, striking him with objects. She was depriving him of food as punishment, making him sit at the table and watch her eat while he went hungry. And she was biting him, repeatedly, obsessively. The forensic odontologist who later examined photos of Eric's injuries was able to match several bite marks definitively to Amanda's dental impressions. The bites were on his face, his ears, his arms, his back. Some were shallow, almost like warnings. Others broke the skin, leaving permanent scars. Why would someone bite a child? It's a question that seems to defy rational explanation. Hitting, as terrible as it is, can be understood as a loss of control, an explosion of anger. But biting is intimate, personal. It requires getting close to the victim, putting your mouth on their skin, applying pressure with your teeth. It's almost vampiric in its violation. Psychologists who study child abuse suggest that biting can be a particularly sadistic form of violence, one that asserts dominance and control. It leaves a mark that's uniquely identifying, a signature of sorts. And for someone like Amanda, someone who seemed to derive satisfaction from hurting Eric, biting may have been a way to literally mark him as hers, to brand him with evidence of her power over him. Eric's world had shrunk to the walls of that house. He no longer went to preschool. He had no friends. His contact with his biological mother Summer was minimal, limited to occasional supervised visits. His father was home in the evenings and on weekends, but David seemed blind to what was happening. Or maybe he saw but couldn't bring himself to believe it. How do you accept that the woman you love, the woman you trust with your child, is a monster? Neighbors would later say they never heard anything unusual from the house. No screaming, no sounds of violence. Amanda was careful. She hurt Eric in ways that wouldn't be overheard in moments when she knew David wasn't around. She threatened Eric, warning him what would happen if he told anyone. She controlled every aspect of his existence. By early 2013, Eric was 4 years old. He should have been in pre-K, learning his ABCs, making friends, preparing for kindergarten. Instead, he was trapped in a house with a woman who hurt him every day, who made his life a living nightmare, who saw him not as a child to be nurtured, but as an object on which to inflict her rage. And through it all, Eric tried to be good. He tried to do what Amanda wanted. He tried not to cry, not to make noise, not to anger her. Because maybe, if he was good enough, quiet enough, obedient enough, she would stop hurting him. But she never stopped. Because this wasn't about anything Eric did or didn't do. This was about Amanda, about something broken and cruel inside her. Eric was just the victim she had access to, the small, powerless target for her violence. In late February 2013, something changed. The abuse intensified in those final days, becoming more frequent, more vicious. We know this from the injuries documented at autopsy, the ones in various stages of healing. There were fresh bruises on top of old bruises, new bite marks overlapping healed ones. The perforated intestine, the injury that would ultimately kill him, occurred within 48 hours of his death. What triggered this final escalation? We don't know for certain. Amanda would later claim that Eric had been acting out, defying her, being difficult. But Eric was 4. Even the most difficult 4-year-old doesn't deserve to be beaten to death. More likely, there was no trigger at all. Amanda's violence had been building over months, over years, and it finally reached its inevitable, terrible conclusion. February 26, 2013, Tuesday. David Dean left for work early in the morning as he always did. He kissed Amanda goodbye. He looked in on Eric, still sleeping in his bed, and felt the rush of love that parents feel for their children. He had no idea that when he left the house that morning, his son was entering the last 48 hours of his life. What happened over the next 2 days would later be reconstructed from Amanda's own statements, from the physical evidence, from the medical examiner's findings. It's a reconstruction that's difficult to read, impossible to fully comprehend. Amanda would later claim that Eric had been misbehaving. He'd refused to eat his breakfast. He'd talked back to her. He'd made a mess. The specifics shifted in her various statements, but the theme remained constant. Eric had done something to anger her. So she hit him. She slapped him across the face, hard enough to snap his head to the side. When he cried, she hit him again. She grabbed him by the arms, her fingers digging into his skin hard enough to leave bruises. She screamed at him, telling him he was bad, worthless, stupid. And then she bit him. She pressed her teeth into his shoulder, into his arm, biting down until he screamed. The pain was excruciating, but when Eric tried to pull away, she held him tighter. This pattern repeated throughout the day. Amanda would hurt Eric, then ignore him for a while. Then something would set her off again and the violence would resume. By evening, when David came home, Eric was quiet, subdued. He didn't eat much dinner. He went to bed early. David noticed nothing wrong, or if he did, he didn't say anything. He would later testify that he'd seen some bruises on Eric in the weeks leading up to his death, but Amanda had explained them. Eric fell. Eric bumped into things. David had no reason not to believe her. February 27, 2013, Wednesday. David left for work again, and once more Eric was alone with Amanda. At some point that day, probably in the afternoon, Amanda hurt Eric in a way that was different from all the times before. She hit him in the stomach. Maybe it was a punch, or maybe she threw something at him. The medical examiner wouldn't be able to determine exactly what caused the injury, but the result was catastrophic. The blow to Eric's abdomen perforated his small intestine. It tore through the delicate tissue, creating a hole through which intestinal contents began to leak into his abdominal cavity. Within hours, bacteria from Eric's digestive tract were spreading through his abdomen, causing peritonitis, a serious and painful infection. Eric would have been in agony. The pain from a perforated intestine is described as severe, constant, unbearable. His abdomen would have become rigid and distended. He would have developed a fever as his body tried to fight the infection. He might have vomited as his digestive system shut down. He would have been crying, screaming, begging for help. And Amanda did nothing. She didn't call for medical help. She didn't tell David when he came home that night. She let Eric lie in his bed, suffering, dying, while she went about her evening as if nothing was wrong. David came home Wednesday evening. Amanda told him Eric wasn't feeling well, that he'd been sick to his stomach. David checked on Eric, who was in bed, pale and quiet. David asked if they should take him to the doctor. Amanda said no, it was probably just a stomach bug. Eric would be fine by morning. Thursday, February 28, 2013, the last day of Eric Dean's life. David left for work again. Amanda waited. She must have known by this point that something was seriously wrong. Eric wasn't getting better. He wasn't crying anymore, which should have been even more alarming. He was barely conscious, his body shutting down as septic shock took hold. Hours passed. Amanda didn't call for help. Later, she would claim she'd been afraid, that she'd known she would get in trouble. She'd known the doctors would see Eric's injuries and ask questions. So she waited, hoping maybe he would get better on his own, hoping maybe she could avoid the consequences of what she'd done. But Eric didn't get better. By mid-morning, he'd stopped responding entirely. His breathing was shallow, irregular. His skin was cold. Finally, at 9:37 in the morning, more than 24 hours after the injury that killed him, Amanda called 911. But she called too late. The damage was irreversible. Eric's body was already in the final stages of septic shock. The infection had overwhelmed his small, battered body. His organs were shutting down. When paramedics arrived and saw Eric's condition, they knew. When doctors at the hospital worked frantically to save him, they knew. And when the medical examiner performed the autopsy, documenting injury after injury after injury, the world finally knew what Eric Dean had endured. He'd been tortured, systematically, repeatedly, cruelly. For more than 2 years, Eric had been hurt by the woman who was supposed to care for him, in the home that was supposed to be his refuge. And the system that was supposed to protect him had failed 15 times to save him. Within hours of Eric's death, the Glenwood Police Department contacted the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension. This was beyond the capacity of a small-town police force. They needed specialized investigators, forensic experts, people trained in handling complex homicide cases. The BCA sent a team immediately. They secured the scene, treating David and Amanda's house as a crime scene. They photographed every room, collected evidence, documented everything that might be relevant to understanding what had happened to Eric. And they began interviewing everyone involved: David Dean, Amanda Peltier, neighbors, relatives, medical personnel, anyone who'd had contact with Eric in the weeks and months before his death. David was questioned first. He was devastated, barely able to speak through his tears. His son was dead, the child he'd fought so hard to protect. He told investigators he had no idea Eric had been being abused. He'd seen bruises occasionally, but Amanda always had explanations, and Eric never told him anyone was hurting him. Investigators pressed him. How could he not have known? How could he have lived in that house and not seen what was happening to his son? David had no answers. He'd worked long hours. He'd trusted Amanda. He'd believed Eric was safe. Maybe he should have looked more closely. Maybe he should have asked more questions. But he'd never imagined that the woman he loved was capable of something like this. As the interview continued, investigators confronted David with some hard truths. Pope County had received 15 reports about Eric. 15 separate concerns about his safety. David's name was in those files because he was Eric's father, because he was legally responsible for his child's welfare. "Did you know about these reports?" an investigator asked. David hesitated. He'd known about some of them. Social workers had contacted him, asked questions, but the cases had always been closed. The county had investigated and found nothing wrong. He'd taken that to mean Eric was fine. "And you never suspected Amanda?" "Never," David said, his voice breaking. "I thought she loved him." The investigators left David and turned their attention to Amanda. She'd been brought to the police station separately, placed in an interview room. She'd been read her Miranda rights, told she was a suspect in Eric's death. She'd waived her right to an attorney, saying she wanted to talk, wanted to explain what had happened. The interrogation of Amanda Peltier lasted for hours. It was recorded, every word documented, and over the course of that interview, Amanda confessed. At first, she tried to minimize what she'd done. Eric had fallen. The injuries were accidents. She'd never meant to hurt him, but investigators confronted her with the medical evidence. Over 100 injuries on Eric's body, injuries in various stages of healing. Bite marks that matched her teeth, a perforated intestine caused by blunt force trauma. "These aren't accidents, Amanda. You hurt this child repeatedly, severely. We need to know why." And slowly, piece by piece, Amanda admitted it. She'd hit Eric. She'd bitten him. She'd thrown things at him. When he cried, she'd hit him harder to make him stop. When he wouldn't listen, she'd hurt him as punishment. "Why?" the investigator asked. "Why did you hurt him?" Amanda's answer was chilling in its inadequacy. "I don't know, I'd get so angry. He'd do things that annoyed me and I couldn't control myself." "What about the intestinal injury, the one that killed him?" Amanda admitted she'd hit Eric in the stomach. She said she hadn't meant to hurt him so badly. She'd thought he would be okay. When he didn't get better, she'd been too afraid to get help. "You let him die," the investigator said. "You injured him badly enough to kill him, and then you let him suffer for more than 24 hours without medical care." Amanda started crying. I'm so sorry. I feel like I took his whole childhood away from him." That statement, recorded on video, would later be played at her trial. "I feel like I took his whole childhood away from him." As if what she'd done was merely Eric of some experiences, rather than rob him of his life. The interview continued. Investigators asked about the previous reports, the multiple times the county had investigated and closed cases. Amanda admitted she'd lied to social workers. She'd coached Eric on what to say. She'd made sure the house looked perfect when investigators came. She'd been careful to inflict injuries that could be explained away. "So you knew what you were doing was wrong?" "Yes." "And you did it anyway?" "Yes." It was a full confession. Amanda Peltier admitted that she'd physically abused Eric Dean, that she'd caused the injury that killed him, and that she delayed seeking medical care until it was too late. She was arrested and charged with second-degree murder. But even as Amanda confessed, investigators were uncovering another layer to this tragedy. They subpoenaed records from Pope County Child Protection, obtaining copies of all 15 reports that had been made about Eric. They interviewed the daycare provider who'd reported bite marks. They spoke with teachers from Happy Times preschool who'd made report after report, begging someone to help this child. And a picture emerged of systemic failure. 15 times, the system had been told that Eric was in danger. 15 times, people had tried to intervene. And 15 times, the system had failed to protect him. The question became, could Eric's death have been prevented? And if so, who was responsible for failing to prevent it? Amanda Peltier was formally charged on March 5, 2013, with 2 counts of second-degree murder in the death of Eric Dean. Under Minnesota law, second-degree murder includes causing someone's death with intent to cause serious bodily harm, but not death itself. Prosecutors argued that while Amanda may not have intended to kill Eric, she certainly intended to hurt him, and that hurt resulted in his death. Amanda pleaded not guilty. Her attorney argued that she had not acted with the intent required for a murder conviction, that Eric's death was a tragic accident, the result of an injury that Amanda hadn't realized was life-threatening. The defense painted a picture of a young woman overwhelmed by the responsibility of caring for a difficult child, someone who'd made mistakes but wasn't a murderer. The prosecution saw things very differently. They argued that Amanda's abuse of Eric was prolonged, systematic, and sadistic. The bite marks alone, more than a dozen documented instances where Amanda had bitten Eric hard enough to leave marks, demonstrated a pattern of intentional cruelty. The perforated intestine, caused by blunt force trauma severe enough to tear through intestinal tissue, showed that Amanda had struck Eric with significant force. And the delay in seeking medical care, the 24-plus hours that Amanda had let Eric suffer before calling 911, demonstrated a callous disregard for his life. The trial began in May 2014, more than a year after Eric's death. The prosecution called witness after witness, building a comprehensive picture of Eric's short life and painful death. The medical examiner testified, walking the jury through the autopsy findings. She showed photos, graphic images of Eric's battered body. She explained how each type of injury occurred, how old each bruise was, how much force was required to cause a perforated intestine. She testified that in her 30 years as a medical examiner, Eric Dean's case was one of the most severe instances of child abuse she'd ever seen. The forensic odontologist testified about the bite marks. He'd made dental impressions of Amanda's teeth and compared them to photos of bite marks on Eric's body. The matches were definitive. Amanda Peltier had bitten Eric Dean multiple times with enough force to break skin. Teachers from Happy Times preschool testified, describing Eric as a sweet, quiet child who'd come to school with injury after injury. They cried on the stand, explaining how helpless they'd felt, how they'd reported and nothing had changed. Colleen Mislicki, the daycare provider who'd made the first reports, testified about the bite marks she'd seen on Eric's back, about Eric's words, "Mommy did it." She described calling Pope County repeatedly, begging them to investigate. And social workers from Pope County testified, a parade of people who'd investigated reports about Eric and closed cases without removing him. Their testimony was painful to hear. They'd suspected abuse. They'd seen injuries. They'd noted in their files that this was a high-risk family. But they'd never had enough proof, never had that smoking gun that would convince a judge to remove Eric from his home. Their testimony raised uncomfortable questions. If the system knew Eric was at risk, why wasn't he saved? If multiple reports came in, why were cases repeatedly closed? The social workers had no good answers. They talked about limited resources, heavy caseloads, the legal burden of proof required to remove a child. They talked about how abusive parents can be skilled manipulators, how children often protect their abusers. But none of it felt like enough. A child was dead, and the system that was supposed to protect him had failed. David Dean testified, though he wasn't required to. He took the stand and told the jury about fighting for custody of Eric, about believing he was bringing his son to safety. He admitted that he'd seen bruises, that social workers had contacted him about reports, but that he'd trusted Amanda's explanations. He described coming home from work and finding his son quiet, sick, being told by Amanda that it was just a stomach bug. "Did you have any idea that Amanda was abusing Eric?" the prosecutor asked. "No," David said, tears streaming down his face. "I loved her. I trusted her with my son. I thought Eric was safe." "Do you blame yourself for what happened?" David's voice broke completely. "Every day, I should have seen it. I should have protected him. He was my son and I failed him." The defense attorney tried to paint David as complicit, suggesting that he must have known what was happening in his own home. But the prosecution argued that Amanda had been careful, strategic, hiding her abuse when David was around. Eric, well trained through fear, had never told his father what was happening. And then Amanda herself took the stand. It was a risky move by the defense, putting their client in front of the jury. But her attorney believed that if the jury saw Amanda as human, as remorseful, they might be more inclined toward a lesser charge. Amanda testified for 2 days. She admitted hitting Eric, biting him, causing the injuries documented at autopsy. But she insisted she'd never meant to kill him. She said she'd been overwhelmed, stressed, unable to cope with caring for a child. She said she'd had a difficult childhood herself, that she'd struggled with anger issues. "I loved Eric," she said, crying on the stand. "I never wanted him to die. I made terrible mistakes, and I'll have to live with that for the rest of my life." The prosecution's cross-examination was brutal. They asked Amanda to explain each injury, each bite mark, each bruise. They asked her why, if she loved Eric, she'd hurt him over 100 times. They asked why she'd let him suffer for more than 24 hours before calling for help. "You knew he was dying, didn't you?" "I thought he might get better." "You knew he needed a doctor." "I was scared." "Scared of getting in trouble." "Yes." "So you let a 4-year-old child die, rather than face consequences for what you'd done." Amanda had no answer for that. The prosecution's closing argument was powerful. They showed the jury photos of Eric, smiling photos from before the abuse escalated, photos of a beautiful little boy with his whole life ahead of him. Then they showed photos from the autopsy, the evidence of what Amanda had done to him. Eric Dean was 4 years old, the prosecutor said. He weighed 33 pounds. He was small, defenseless, completely dependent on the adults in his life to care for him. And Amanda Peltier, the woman who was supposed to protect him, tortured him. For more than 2 years, she systematically abused this child. She hit him. She bit him. She starved him. She terrorized him. And when her abuse finally caused a fatal injury, she let him die rather than seek help. The prosecutor paused, letting the weight of those words settle over the courtroom. The defense wants you to believe this was an accident, a mistake, the act of someone overwhelmed and struggling. But the evidence tells a different story. This was intentional. This was cruel. This was murder. And Amanda Peltier needs to be held accountable for what she did to Eric Dean. The defense's closing argument focused on Amanda's age, her lack of criminal history, her difficult childhood. They argued for a lesser charge, for recognition that Amanda hadn't set out to kill Eric, that she'd made terrible choices but wasn't a murderer in the traditional sense. But as the jury filed out to deliberate, the weight in the courtroom suggested which way the verdict would go. It took the jury less than 8 hours. On May 15, 2014, they returned with their verdict, guilty on both counts of second-degree murder. Amanda showed no reaction as the verdict was read. She sat still, staring straight ahead, as the judge thanked the jury and scheduled sentencing for the following month. At sentencing in June 2014, Eric's family was given the opportunity to address the court. His grandmother, David's mother, spoke about the grandson she'd loved and lost. She described Eric as a sweet, gentle child who deserved so much better than the life he'd been given. Eric was robbed of everything, she said. His childhood, his future, his chance to grow up and be happy. Amanda Peltier took all of that from him, and nothing the court does will bring him back. The judge, in pronouncing sentence, was firm and clear. Under Minnesota law, second-degree murder carries a maximum sentence of 40 years. The judge sentenced Amanda Peltier to life in prison without the possibility of parole for 24 years. "You betrayed the trust placed in you as a caregiver," the judge said. "You inflicted unimaginable pain on a defenseless child. You showed no mercy to Eric Dean, and this court will show no mercy to you." Amanda was led away in handcuffs. She would spend decades behind bars, her young life effectively over. But for Eric's family, for the community, for everyone who'd tried and failed to save Eric, the conviction felt hollow. Justice had been served, yes, but Eric was still dead. And the question remained, why had the system failed so catastrophically to protect him? In the weeks and months following Amanda Peltier's conviction, Eric Dean's story became national news. Media outlets across the country picked up the case, focusing not just on Amanda's crimes, but on the systemic failures that had allowed those crimes to continue for years. 15 reports, 15 opportunities to save Eric's life. 15 times the child protection system had been alerted and had failed to act decisively. In Minnesota, public outrage was immediate and intense. How could this have happened? How could a county receive 15 reports about a child and still leave him in an abusive home? What was the point of mandatory reporting laws if reports were ignored? Governor Mark Dayton, facing intense political pressure, ordered a comprehensive review of the child protection system statewide. He established a task force to examine what had gone wrong in Eric's case and to recommend reforms that would prevent similar tragedies. The task force's findings, released in September 2014, were damning. They identified multiple points of failure in Eric's case. Social workers had been overworked, carrying caseloads far beyond recommended limits. There was inadequate training in recognizing patterns of abuse. There was no effective system for tracking multiple reports about the same child and recognizing escalating risk. And crucially, there was a culture within child protection that prioritized keeping families together over child safety. The report noted that Pope County had received reports about Eric from multiple sources, teachers, daycare providers, medical professionals, but had treated each report as an isolated incident rather than recognizing the pattern. No one had looked at all 15 reports together and seen the clear trajectory toward Eric's death. In response to the task force's findings, Governor Dayton announced sweeping reforms to Minnesota's child protection system. These reforms, which became known as Eric's Law in some circles, included mandatory review panels for cases with multiple reports, reduced caseloads for social workers, enhanced training in child abuse recognition, and stricter protocols for when children must be removed from potentially dangerous homes. The reforms also included provisions for better coordination between different agencies. In Eric's case, his preschool had made multiple reports, his daycare provider had made multiple reports, and medical professionals had raised concerns. But there was no system for ensuring all these different sources were talking to each other, for creating a complete picture of what Eric was experiencing. But for Eric's grandmother, Stepson, these reforms weren't enough. She wanted accountability. She wanted the people who'd failed to save Eric to face consequences for their inaction. In 2017, Jolene filed a wrongful death lawsuit against Pope County and several individual social workers. The lawsuit alleged that the county had been negligent in investigating reports about Eric, that they'd violated their duty to protect a vulnerable child, and that their failures had directly contributed to Eric's death. The lawsuit was complex, legally and emotionally. It asked the courts to determine something unprecedented. Could a government agency and its employees be held civilly liable for failing to protect a child from abuse? Minnesota law, like most state laws, provides some immunity to government employees acting in their official capacity. The reasoning is that without such immunity, social workers would be paralyzed by fear of lawsuits, unable to make difficult judgment calls. But Jalene's attorneys argued that this immunity shouldn't extend to cases of gross negligence, to situations where the failures were so egregious that accountability was necessary. The case wound through the courts for years. In 2019, a district court dismissed the lawsuit, ruling that the social workers had immunity and that the county couldn't be held liable for the actions of Amanda Peltier, who was not a government employee. But Jalene appealed. She took the case to the Minnesota Court of Appeals, arguing that the district court had applied the wrong legal standard. The appellate court agreed with the dismissal but for different reasons, leading to another appeal. Finally, in November 2021, the Minnesota Supreme Court weighed in. In a significant ruling, the court reinstated parts of Jalene's lawsuit, finding that there were genuine questions about whether the social worker's actions constituted gross negligence. The court wrote that if a jury found the social workers had acted with a reckless disregard for Eric's safety, they might not be entitled to immunity. The case was sent back to district court for trial. As of this writing, it remains unresolved, still working its way through the legal system. The outcome will have significant implications for child protection nationwide, potentially opening the door for families to hold government agencies accountable when they fail to protect children. But legal proceedings, however important, can't undo what happened. They can't bring Eric back. They can't give him the childhood he deserved, the life he should have lived. In Glenwood, Minnesota, there's a small memorial to Eric Dean. It's in a park, a place where children play. There's a bench with a plaque that reads, "In memory of Eric Parker Dean, December 27, 2008 to February 28, 2013, gone too soon, never forgotten." Visitors leave flowers there sometimes, stuffed animals, little toys, tokens of remembrance for a boy most of them never knew but whose story touched them deeply. Eric would have been 17 years old now in 2026. He'd be in high school, maybe playing sports or learning to drive. He'd be thinking about college, about his future, about all the possibilities that life holds. He should have had all of that. He should have had the chance to grow up, to become whoever he was meant to be. Instead, he's a cautionary tale, a reminder of what happens when systems fail, when warning signs are ignored, when the vulnerable fall through the cracks. The people who knew Eric, who tried to help him, carry the weight of his death. Colleen Mislicki, the daycare provider who made those first reports, has spoken publicly about the guilt she feels. "I knew something was wrong," she said in interviews. "I reported it over and over, but I couldn't save him, and I'll always wonder if there was something more I could have done." The teachers at Happy Times Preschool, the ones who made report after report, feel the same guilt. They did everything they were supposed to do. They were mandatory reporters and they reported. But Eric still died and they still feel like they failed him. Even the social workers who investigated Eric's case carry trauma from it. Some have left the field entirely, unable to continue working in child protection after this failure. Others have become advocates for reform, using Eric's case as an example of why the system needs to change. David Dean, Eric's father, has largely stayed out of the public eye. He wasn't charged with any crime. Prosecutors determined that he genuinely hadn't known about the abuse. But he lives with the knowledge that his son was tortured and killed in his own home by the woman he loved and trusted. That's a burden no one should have to carry. And Amanda Peltier sits in prison, serving her life sentence. She'll be eligible for parole in 2037 when she's 49 years old. Whether she'll ever be released is unclear. What is clear is that she took a child's life, and nothing can change that. Eric Dean's story is not unique. Every year, children die from abuse and neglect despite being known to child protection systems. The National Child Abuse and Neglect Data System reports that in the United States, approximately 1,700 children die annually from abuse or neglect. And in many of those cases, there were warning signs, there were reports, there were opportunities for intervention that were missed. The question is, what do we do with that knowledge? How do we build systems that actually protect children, that don't just respond to reports but effectively assess risk and take action when necessary? There are no easy answers. Child protection is extraordinarily difficult work. Social workers are asked to make life and death decisions with imperfect information, limited resources, and the knowledge that they'll be blamed whether they remove children too readily or fail to remove them when they should. But Eric's case shows that something has to change. 15 reports is not a gray area. 15 reports is a blaring alarm that something is catastrophically wrong, and when that alarm sounds, we have to listen. Since Eric's death, Minnesota has implemented reforms. Caseloads have been reduced in some counties, training has been enhanced, review protocols have been strengthened, but advocates say there's still much more to do. Funding for child protection remains inadequate. Turnover among social workers remains high, meaning inexperienced workers are often handling the most complex cases. And the fundamental tension remains. How do you balance family preservation with child safety? Eric Dean should be alive today. That's the simple, devastating truth. He should have been saved. The system had 15 chances to save him, and it failed 15 times. His death is a tragedy, but it's also a call to action. We owe it to Eric and to every vulnerable child to do better, to build systems that actually protect, to listen when children tell us they're in danger, to act decisively when the warning signs are clear. Because Eric's voice was silenced on February 28, 2013, but his story continues to speak. It speaks to the failures of systems, to the importance of vigilance, to the need for reform. It speaks to the value of every child's life and to our collective responsibility to protect the most vulnerable among us. Eric Dean was 4 years old. He weighed 33 pounds. He loved playing with toys, watching cartoons, eating peanut butter sandwiches. He had his father's eyes and a smile that could light up a room. He deserved to grow up. He deserved to be safe. He deserved to live. And we collectively failed him. The only way to honor Eric's memory is to ensure that what happened to him never happens to another child. To make his death mean something by fixing the systems that failed him. To listen when children cry for help. To act when the warning signs appear. To never, ever look away. Because every child deserves what Eric never got. The chance to grow up safe, loved, and protected. Every child deserves to have their voice heard. Every child deserves to be saved. Eric Dean's story is a tragedy, but it doesn't have to be in vain. If his death leads to reforms that save even one child, if his story teaches us to be more vigilant, more willing to act, more committed to protecting the vulnerable, then perhaps something meaningful can emerge from this darkness. But we have to do the work. We have to demand better from our child protection systems. We have to fund them adequately, train workers properly, and hold agencies accountable when they fail. We have to be willing to intervene when children are at risk, even when it's uncomfortable, even when families push back. Because the alternative is unacceptable. The alternative is more children like Eric, falling through the cracks, suffering in silence, dying in homes where they should have been safe. Eric Parker Dean lived for 4 years, 3 months, and 1 day. His life was short and much of it was filled with pain, but he mattered. He was loved by some, failed by many, but he mattered. And his story, painful as it is to hear, needs to be told. Because only by confronting these failures, by acknowledging what went wrong, can we hope to do better. For Eric, for every child like him, for every small voice that cries out for help. We have to listen, we have to act, we have to do better. Because children like Eric Dean are depending on us, and we must not fail them again. Thank you for taking the time to hear Eric's story. If you or someone you know suspects a child is being abused, please call the Child Help National Child Abuse Hotline at 1-800-422-4453. That's 1-800-422-4453. The call is free, confidential, and available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. You could save a life. Rest in peace, Eric Parker Dean. You deserved so much better than the world gave you. You are not forgotten.